It had been raining all day, and the sky was low, as if it had covered the hospital with a damp bag. It was cold in the reception area. The tiles were slippery underfoot, and the ventilation was buzzing so that it seemed as if someone was breathing in the ceiling. Nastya was sitting at the counter, wrapped in an old knitted sweatshirt, and lazily chasing a mouse across the monitor. There were 3 hours left until midnight, and everything went according to the usual routine. Pills, blood pressure, a couple of grandmas with ischemia. The paramedic on duty, Kornilov, was working on the coffee maker, cursing in a low voice. The device was buzzing, but it wasn't pumping water. Vovka, the orderly, was sleeping off somewhere in the residence room. And the doctor, Panov, an old cardiologist, was locked in his office and reading a newspaper, pulling his glasses over his forehead. Everything was quiet until there was a sharp creak of a gurney in the hallway and a thud on the doors from the street. 2 people wheeled the gurney in, an ambulance driver and a young paramedic, very green, holding a medical history and shaking hands. There was a man lying on a stretcher, not old, but his face was distorted, as if he had been beaten with something heavy. His head was bandaged. There was a blood stain under the bandage, his clothes were torn, his boots were knee-deep in mud, and there was a black coating under his fingernails. Nastya was the first to smell the stench, not the usual hospital rottenness, but a sweet and sour smell, like from rotten meat. She staggered back, watching as the patient twitched and opened his eyes, bleary, rolled up like a dead cat's. While she was completing the paperwork, Kornilov checked her pulse and tried to inject her. Her skin was hard as rubber, and the syringe wouldn't work. The man moved and suddenly grabbed the paramedic by the arm, not letting go, as if in a death grip. Orderly Vovka stormed out of the residence room and tried to pull the patient away, but he leaned on him with his whole body and bit into his shoulder like a mad dog. Blood gushed out immediately. Nastya screamed, but no one reacted. The paramedic dropped the ampules. Everything shattered on the floor, lay in fragments. The man growled as if he had a pipe instead of a throat, and continued to gnaw until Vovka was quiet. Kornilov was the first to realize. He grabbed a stool and hit the patient's head with all his might. He collapsed, but immediately tried to get up, as if he hadn't felt the blow. Blood from Vovka spread across the floor, mixing with broken glass and bleach. 5 minutes later, there were already 3 people in the receiver. Nastya, Kornilov, and the ambulance driver, who, having seen all this, tried to call someone on the radio, but it only hissed. The phone call did not go through. The landline buzzed like a burnt-out transformer. Panov rushed out of the office with shaking hands and shouted something about the police. But the patient had already got up, staggering like a doll, and walked straight at him. The blow was not strong, but the old man fell like a sack and did not get up. Nastya rushed into the treatment room, slammed the door and locked it, and Kornilov and the driver broke the glass and jumped out into the rain, right into the mud. There was a dull rumble from the receiver, as if the cabinet had been overturned, and again that inhuman rattle. It was damp and gray outside, and there was a smell of burning from the gate. Tires were burning somewhere in the distance. Kornilov, covered in mud, was breathing heavily, watching as the driver ran to the ambulance and yelled into the radio. Dim light could be seen from the hospital windows. Someone was moving inside, but not like an ordinary person. Nastya, sitting in the treatment room, was shaking, holding her hand over her mouth, and listening to someone scratching the door with her nails. The noise didn't stop. Someone was falling, someone was hitting cabinets, moans and wet slurping could be heard. They were breathing outside the door, not like people but heavily, hollowly, as if the air had been forced into their lungs by hand. It was only the first night, and none of them knew yet what was going on outside the hospital. It was just beginning. When the silence in the receiver dragged on, Pashka Shumeko, an intern from surgery, decided to go see for himself where everyone had gone. The guy was new, one of those who are sent to the wilderness for residency debts, thin, nervous, always wearing headphones. He went down to the first floor, looked into the corridor. It was empty. The lights were flashing. Water was squelching under his feet. There were streaks of blood on the floor, and a dirty palm print on the wall. There was a bathrobe lying in one of the rooms, as if someone had jumped out of it in a panic. Pashka walked slowly, listening, and suddenly he heard a dull sound. From the morgue. Down there, where there's an eternal stink, and the lamps are yellow, like in a toilet. The basement with the morgue was old, dating back to Soviet times. The walls were peeling, the pipes were sweating from dampness, and the ventilation had not worked since spring. Pashka turned on the flashlight because the lamps blinked and went out. It's slippery underfoot, and someone recently spilled something that looks like formalin. There was a gurney in the hallway, covered with a sheet. The uniform was already stained, and someone's shoes were in the corner. Pashka called out, "Is anyone alive?" and was startled by the sound of his voice. There was no response. Only a thud came from the far side, as if a cabinet had fallen, or someone had crashed into the wall. He pushed open the door to the dissecting room. It was dark inside, just the pulsing light from a flashlight. In the far corner, someone was sitting, or standing, it's unclear. The back is visible, covered in spots. Pashka took a step, and the flashlight slid across the floor. Someone's face was reflected in the puddle, but without eyes. The one who was sitting jerked sharply and turned around, and Pashka staggered back. There was something standing in front of him, covered in blood, with his arms twisted as if the joints had been broken. It jumped onto the gurney, screaming, and the guy, without thinking, rushed back. He didn't hear how he was yelling, he just ran, stumbling, until he crashed into the metal door of the refrigerator compartment. Something crashed into the door from the other side, not with a fist, but with a body. The knocking was dull, heavy, then again. Pashka yelled and started hitting the door, but it wouldn't open. There was a buzz in the corner. The old freezer turned on, as luck would have it. Frost began to cover the room, and his teeth chattered from fear, not from the cold. Someone was breathing outside the door, raggedly, hoarsely, and scratching at the iron with his fingernails like a rat. The guy covered his ears with his hands, pressed himself against the wall and sobbed, for the first time truly realizing that this was no longer a practice or a madhouse. This is something completely different. Meanwhile, in the hallway, another intern, Slavka Dudin, was trying to find Pashka. He found his flashlight at the entrance to the basement and shouted, "Are you there?" There was silence in response. He went downstairs clutching a metal tray in his hand. I saw a trail of blood on the floor, as if someone was being dragged. Slavka knew that everything was tight-lipped here. He hadn't been working for the first day. But when he saw the refrigerator door ajar and his fingers sticking out from under it, he realized that he had to get out. But it was too late. A silhouette jumped out of the darkness and jumped on him, and the lantern flew into the wall and went out. Upstairs, Kornilov reached into a closed first aid kit and rummaged through the entire ampule drawer. Nastya knocked from inside the treatment room, but he did not open it. He was afraid that someone was behind her. No one came back from the street. The hospital was buzzing like an empty box. He injected himself with caffeine so as not to lose consciousness, and trembling, listened to footsteps in the hallway. Someone was walking slowly, not alone. A step is a pause. A rustle is another step. Kornilov grabbed a scalpel and hid by the door. He knew that the sound wasn't from a human. They don't walk like that. Kornilov knew that he would not stay in the pharmacy for long. The glass door wouldn't hold up if someone pushed against it, and all he had in his hands was a scalpel and a broken chair. He stood in the dark, listening to the creaking of the floors. The footsteps faded in and out, as if someone was poking around the hallway, sniffing. Sometimes there was splashing. It looked like someone was walking on the water, but there was no water in the receiver. The smell was no longer just rotten, but something chemical, like a burning rubber mattress. He remembered how the sick man clung to Vovka, and how he screamed, and then did not make a sound anymore. Kornilov was breathing through his sleeve. His head was swimming. Fear was sticky, like wet clothes. He realized that if he sat there, he would die like a rat in a jar. When he got ready, he got out from behind the counter, picked up a pair of scissors, broke off the handle of a drawer, wrapped a bandage around his palm, and made himself something like brass knuckles. The lights are almost out, and the backup generator seems to be dead too. He moved down the corridor, stealthily, looking at the door jambs, where there were already brown handprints. Someone was standing at the main entrance, a shadow, motionless, swaying slightly. He froze. Someone else's breathing could be heard. Not a scream, not a cough, but deep breathing, as if pumping pus. Kornilov took a step back, but the tiles creaked, and the shadow jerked its head sharply. He turned around and ran down a side corridor to the resident's office, past puddles, past something trampled, like a piece of jaw. He rushed into the resident's office, locked the door, and slid the desk shut. There was a crunch underfoot. The bandage, splattered with blood, was lying by the chair. Someone was already here. The window was open, and sirens could be heard from somewhere in the distance. He looked out and froze. The courtyard was empty, but someone had already broken down the gate, and the door to the maternity ward was open. There are smeared footprints on the asphalt, as if someone had run through it. Kornilov realized that it was no better outside the perimeter. He went to the closet, pulled out a pack of disposable bathrobes, and began stuffing them into the crack under the door. It was getting hard to breathe, and he didn't know if it was from fear or if something was already in the air. Half an hour later, there was a knock on the resident's door. Carefully at first, then louder. Kornilov braced himself, clutching the scissors, but the voice outside the door was human, Nastya. When he opened it, she was pale, her eyes bulging, and her hands were shaking. A laboratory assistant from the third floor stood behind her. Ksyuka, pregnant, barefoot, without a bathrobe, in only a sweatshirt. They were both shaking, as if they had run through the entire hospital. Kornilov locked the door, poured alcohol into a plastic cup, and gave them a drink. Nastya said that they were breaking into the treatment room, but then suddenly everything went quiet. She waited for half an hour and came out when it became very quiet. In the hallway, she saw someone sitting against the wall and gnawing his own hand. The three of them stayed in the resident's room until it started to get light. The morning brought nothing. The generators were silent. There was no light. The connection did not work. Kornilov went to the server room, hoping to find an old emergency phone, but found only the corpse of a technician with his face buried in the keyboard. Blood was leaking out of his mouth, and his tongue looked gray, as if it had been boiled. He snatched the key to the emergency exit from him and returned. Ksyuka was sitting with her face buried in her stomach. Nastya was smoking by the window, not saying a word. It was light outside, but there was no one there. No cars, no people. Only emptiness and trembling in my chest from the fact that this is just the beginning. At about 8 o'clock in the morning, they decided that staying here was death. Kornilov broke the lock on the pharmacy, collected ampules, syringes, bandages, bleach, everything that can be carried in a backpack. Ksyuka was given an anesthetic. She was sick. She could barely stand on her feet. They went out through the technical entrance, down the stairs to the old laundry room. It smelled of mold and cobwebs, but the way to the basement was open. They had to get to the old underground exit that led to the utility block. But in the hallway they saw a door locked from the outside with a thick wire. Behind her, someone was moving and calling, "Hey! Who's there? Open up!" A wire-wrapped door led to an old storage room for clean laundry, where laundry bags used to be loaded, but no one had used this entrance for 10 years. Behind her stood a kid in his 20s wearing a rumpled security sweater, a hard hat, and a rubber baton. He was shaking with cold and fear, and his teeth were chattering. He said his name was Ilya. He was from the shift that guarded the hospital outside at the back gate. The other two disappeared at night. One went to the receiver at the noise and did not return. The second locked himself in the booth and stopped contacting. Ilya had been hiding here since midnight, and he heard gunshots, screams, and screeching, as if pigs were being slaughtered. Then everything abruptly quieted down. He hardly slept, sat with a baton against the wall, keeping every rustle at gunpoint. The four of them gathered together. Kornilov, Nastya, Ilya, and Ksyuka, a pregnant laboratory assistant who was getting worse. She felt sick, sweating, and her lips turned white. They wrapped her in a blanket, poured glucose intramuscularly, and Kornilov said he didn't have time. He had to go. The goal was a utility block behind the hospital building. There was once a heating main with access to the boiler room, and rumors circulated that in those corridors there was an exit to an old shelter from the time of the Civil War. The card found in the pocket of the first patient just showed a mark in that direction. Kornilov didn't like it. There were too many coincidences. Everything was too fast. But there were no options. There's a building full of dead people around, and who knows how many there are already. The way to the utility block went through the garage sector. They made their way through the dark corridors, smelling of fuel oil, mold, and rotten medicines. The floor was slippery. It was sinking in places, and some kind of black slime was running down the walls. It was unclear whether from the sewer or something worse. On one of the doors was written, "Do not enter without a mask." And there was a soft rustle from inside, as if someone was sorting through packages. Nastya wouldn't let us open it. She said we'd had enough of these surprises. On the way, they found an iron cabinet containing an old axe, a tire iron, and a helmet. They took everything with them. Even Ilya's baton seemed useless now. They were spotted at the turn into the boiler room. The first one to run out was the same orderly Vovka. Now only a shell remains of him. His eyes are bleary, and his right arm is twisted out, as if he tore it out for himself. He didn't growl or scream, but just walked, dragging his foot, and others appeared behind him, in lab coats, in uniform caps, with bloody faces, as if the entire hospital fraternity had decided to return for a shift. Kornilov shouted at them to run. Ilya hit the first one in the temple with a tire iron, but he did not fall. Just the head twitched like a rubber doll, and that was it. They realized that they would not be able to force their way through. The crowd was already blocking their passage back. I had to rush through the boiler room. Kornilov hit the lock with a piece of rebar. Nastya broke the plywood panel. Kshuka was dragged through first. It smelled of burning and grease, as if something had recently been burned there. The boilers were dead. The pipes leaked. Steam hissed from the holes, creating the feeling that someone was breathing right into his back. In the far corner, they found a shaft with a ladder down, smeared with soot, narrow but deep. Ilya climbed in first, followed by Kshuka, then Nastya. Kornilov stayed on the upper landing until he heard someone flying into the boiler room, knocking everything down on the move. He jumped off, broke the step, but managed to close the hatch behind him. Beneath them was a network of old concrete corridors, cramped, low, lit only by emergency lights that blinked as if on their last legs. There were numbers on the walls, like in an air raid shelter. Sector 3, Passage 2, B, Line C. Footsteps echoed loudly in the concrete, and the air was thick and humid, as if no one had breathed here for decades. Spiders, rats, mold, everything is as it should be. But something was wrong. They saw footprints, not old, not dusty. Someone was here. And recently. And in Kornilov's pocket was a map on which a dot marked the area at the very end of the corridor, near the room, signed, Station. The corridor led down, not smoothly but with a sharp slope, as if someone had pulled a bone out of the ground and left a wound. The lights flickered on and off, and every step echoed in the walls, as if someone was walking behind them in unison. Kshuka was barely walking. Nastya was supporting her by the elbow. Both of their faces were as white as dead ones. Ilya tried to joke that it all looked more like a quest than a real fuck up. But his voice was shaking, and it was obvious that he was feeling bad himself. Kornilov was the last to go, holding an axe in his hand and looking around every now and then. Empty. But there was no feeling that they were alone. Rusty signs began to appear on the walls. Ceiling. Lock number 2. Block D. The air was stale, as if someone had already breathed it, and breathed for a long time without stopping. At the end, the tunnel led to an old door made of thick iron, on which was written in red felt-tip pen, Station. Admission is by pass. Under the inscription, something was scratched with nails, but it was impossible to make out, except for the last word. Run. The door was ajar. When they pushed her, she was immediately hit in the face. The smell of dust, formalin, and something else, like a mixture of fuel oil and rotten plastic. Inside, there was a huge room like a hangar, crammed with equipment. Consoles, racks, wires, refrigeration units, glass boxes with broken glass. Protective suits lay on the floor, torn and burned in places. In the corner is a cart with documents, twisted, as if after an explosion. The walls are cracked, and the ceiling has collapsed in places. Nastya went to the console, pressed the button, and surprisingly the dim lighting came on. The power was still on somewhere. Apparently, the old system was on standby. A logo appeared on one of the monitors. NII-14, Biological Protection, Department 6B. Then there was a creaking sound as someone turned on a dictaphone. The voice was male, muffled, tired. If anyone hears we're locked in, there are 3 left. The rest are dead or worse. They broke out. It was not possible to isolate. Access code 006, object A3, carrier, activated. They were mistaken. The recording ended with a pop, and a hiss hung in the speakers. Everyone was silent. Even Ilya, who had been trying to stay awake, stood with his eyes wide open, as if he had been hit in the forehead. The A3 laboratory was marked on a map of the station attached to the wall, from which, apparently, the breakthrough took place. Judging by the diagrams, it was located behind a hermetic door on the next level, where an elevator led, walled up by a slab with the inscription, "Control, only from the surface." Shuka sat down on a box, breathing heavily. She started having contractions, not strong, but it was already going on. Kornilov knew that she would not last long, and even more so under these conditions. He offered to stay here, wait it out, and barricade himself, but Nastya sharply objected. She didn't believe in barricades. Everything that could be closed has already been opened. If this virus or whatever it is has gone outside, then you won't be able to sit it out. It was necessary to understand where he came from, and if there was a chance to stop him. At least that's something. A second server room was found in the far wing of the station. There was only one console working there, but it had access to the surveillance logs. The last videos were cut out, leaving only fragments, blurred frames showing a man emerging from a glass capsule. His face was familiar. It was the same patient from the emergency room, with a broken head and a torn peacoat. Only he looked different. Smooth, clean, as if he had been released not after the accident, but after preparation. He looked directly at the camera, then nodded to someone off camera. And 5 minutes later, chaos began in the station. Flashes, running, blood on the walls, someone's severed hands. Kornilov turned off the console and sat down. He was silent, but it was clear that something had cracked in him. It all fit. The man was brought in for a reason. He was sent, in advance. It was as if someone had tried, tested the system for strength, or maybe even launched it. It only made it worse. It's not a virus from the basement. This is an operation, with clear logistics, with a sweep, with a cover. They were not victims, but extras in the experiment. And if so, then all they saw was just the first act. And the next wave is on its way. The station was buzzing, as if wires were crawling in the walls, as if they were alive. The generator was rattling at its limit, the lights were flickering, and thuds could be heard in the corners, muffled, as if someone was slowly hammering his fist into concrete. Kashuka could hardly walk anymore. Nastya was dragging her by the arm, and Ilya was holding a rusty fire extinguisher, as if he could save them. Kornilov went first. There was no fear or hope left on his face, only anger and burning irritation, like a person to whom everything is already clear. He knew it wasn't an accident. Someone launched this person, someone gave a command. Everything that happened in the hospital was not a flash, but a phase, a trial run, along the chain. They found the second door. It was a large one with an airtight lock which had a code shield and a crack, as if it had been hit with a sledgehammer. The code worked, the same 006 from the recording. The lock clanged, the door opened with a bang, and the smell hit my nose. Not the stench, not the rot, but the cold, sterile air, like from a refrigerator. There is a laboratory inside. Overturned chairs, scattered ampules, frozen bodies in robes, covered in frost. Everything seemed to freeze in the middle of motion. In boxing there is a second capsule. A guy with pipes, but alive. His eyes were open, and he was looking directly at Kornilov, as if he knew who he was. And on the wall above it is the date. Fresh. Today's one. Kornilov tore off the cover from the remote control, pulled out the power supply, broke through the access system with fittings and turned on emergency sterilization. The ventilation howled, the UV lights flashed on, and the doors began to slam shut automatically. Nastya understood what he was doing and did not interfere. Everything was clear. It was the last branch. If they leave, someone will launch the next one. If not now, then later. And so it goes again, along the chain. Water, blood, air, a handshake. The mechanism was already working. He couldn't be stopped. But it was possible to burn the station to the ground. While the decontamination system was on, they returned to the first level, dragging Shuka on themselves. Kornilov found a remote detonation unit in the control panel, an old Soviet thing that didn't seem to work. But it did. 8 kilograms of TNT, hidden in the shafts under the reactor. The station shuddered as the time report started. 1 minute left. No one was running. They just stood there. Ilya tightened his grip on Nastya's hand. Kshuka lay with her eyes closed, but she was still breathing. But Kornilov was looking at the ceiling, as if he were seeing the sky instead of concrete. The explosion was short and sharp, but it worked. The station was blown up from the inside. The concrete settled, the blocks collapsed, the old wires caught fire, and the ventilation corridors collapsed like cardboard. The fire went up, swept through the mines, hitting everything that was alive. No one got out. No one got up after that. There were no capsules, no boxes, no half-decomposed bodies wandering in the basements. Everything is in the dust. Slowly, smoothly, honestly. No heroes, no final speeches, no miracles. It's just the end. 2 days later, the city was cleared. We arrived with chemical protection, with technicians, with cleaning. No one explained anything. They blamed it on a gas leak and a short circuit. The documents were burned, and there were no witnesses left. No videos, no recordings. Only one archive has a map left, with a red dot in the forest, which is now empty. No station, no entrance, no footprints. And somewhere far away, in another area, in another city, some doctor will see a patient. A guy in a ragged peacoat, without documents, with empty eyes,